In this video, we're going to be talking about something truly eerie, tragic, and just downright creepy about two little girls and a family's story about grief that no family should ever have to go through. This is one of the worst ways you can grieve imaginable. Although these two little girls lived their own separate lives, they also dealt with a lot more than just the lives that they were given. John and Florence Pollock were the utmost decent younger couple that were living in Hexham, England. They were renting a home there, and they were expecting a pregnancy very soon of their first little girl. And they were very spiritual, very religious people. Everything they did was centered around their roots in religion and the way that they believed about life. And they were quiet. They kept to themselves, but they were ready. They were preparing to have this baby. Florence's doctor was scheduling, upkeeping multiple continuous appointments throughout this 9 months that Florence and John were probably scared, nervous, excited, and looking forward to it. But they didn't have much to worry about because this doctor was taking care, making sure that the pregnancy's health was to its utmost highest standards. They did their preparations. They got a crib, they got clothes, they even got toys for their little girl. And they were planning on raising this little girl up in the church life of Catholicism. And they had a local church that they had already started to go to, and this is where they would go with their little girl. But to their unexpected surprise, something scary happens, and it's not necessarily a negative thing, but once Florence went into labor, she did have her little girl, and the little girl was healthy. That all went according to plan. But what they didn't expect was a second little girl at the same time. They had twins, you guys, and I'm sure this was a completely stressful situation for them. They were probably nervous wrecks, wondering what they were going to do. They named them Jillian and Jennifer. The twins, they were perfectly healthy. Across the board, everything checked out. They even came out smiling, and they were very close as sisters go. And although they did everything together and they were the same person from the looks of it, one thing did separate them drastically. Jennifer. She actually was born with two birthmarks, one on her hip and another on her forehead. And although this isn't an uncommon thing for probably you and me, I mean, I have a lot of freckles. I don't have any birthmarks, but I have freckles, It is a very uncommon thing for twins, especially, one having birthmarks and the other not. John and Florence were now taking their twins throughout the church, just building up a consistency. That's what they enjoyed as a family, especially happy consistency, creating happy memories. They all spent a considerable amount of time together as the four of them. Not only were they raising these daughters of theirs that were very, very young, but throughout Hexham, they were driving all around town, not only to the church, but they would take the girls pretty much sightseeing around town. This was their thing. They liked to drive around as the four of them, close-knit. But throughout this, John and Florence started to notice something really strange, really bizarre. Not just like the birthmarks, but this was something a lot more questionable, something that kind of stuck out to them that these little girls were now doing. In addition to the way that these little girls would talk, the way that they would act, the way that they would sort of make themselves seem older than they actually were. They were only about 2 or 3 years old at this time, but the way that they spoke about their lives, you would think that they've already lived 10 years of life, knowing things that maybe they shouldn't have. They were able to remember things that they never really physically nor visually experienced on their own. They actually knew pretty intricate, detailed, complex things about Hexham. They had never been away from John and Florence on their own. It's not like as a couple of 2-year-olds were getting into the car and driving around and getting life experiences and having fun on their own like adults. They were little girls, so how could they have known anything about Hexham besides from the times that they were with their parents? Remembering locations, saying, hey, remember when we did this at this place? Now, they'd never been to those places, but they remembered things about being there. In particular, these little girls were driving around with their parents one day, and this was just a shell shock to their parents. John and Florence noticed something that they could no longer deem as just a coincidence, because their twin girls, although they were still toddlers, they recognized the school called Hexham Abbey and a playground nearby, a playground that they had claimed to had played in at some point in their lives. Even though they weren't even born yet, they remembered things from years ago, recounting some fun that they had. This was not just a coincidence anymore, though, for John and Florence. This was something more. They couldn't just brush this off. This was a new can of worms that was bound to be opened. What made it even weirder was that the twin girls even somehow knew different routes different roads that they could use in the car to get to this place, to this school, to this playground. This just struck John especially, and it went back in time a little bit to something that he brought up to Florence before the girls were even born. It was something that dealt with the way that he believed about life, his outlook on just how the circle of life would play out for everybody in the world. It was something that made this situation totally strange as part of a way that you think about your family. Some would cause some pretty heated arguments between John and Florence. John and Florence would sometimes have a simple conversation and brush it off, like any other couple would, and sometimes they would get themselves into some pretty heated arguments as a couple. Okay, so at a certain point, before the girls were even born, it went too far, and it was continuing to go too far. John thought, you know what? The doctor thought that we were going to have one girl. But since we're having not just one but two, and they're twins, this must mean something. You know, Florence, I think that our girls might be reborn from another generation of life. And Florence was not okay with this. This struck a chord so deep, it upset her. They grew to despise this idea, at least Florence did towards John. And for the first few years of the kids' lives, these twins, all that Florence wanted was a comfortable, safe home of purity and church and consistency, and this was definitely not what she was expecting out of John at all. It even got so bad that after a while, Florence was even threatening to file for divorce. She was going to separate herself entirely from John, take the girls with her. You know, John, we don't have to continue doing this with you. If this is how your beliefs are going to be in raising our girls, we're out. That's pretty much how she was taking the entire situation. I mean, imagine, you guys, you're young, I'm 28, and one day I'm going to be a parent, maybe, hopefully, and you just want a healthy family, right? But then your spouse, the person that you're supposed to trust, the person you're supposed to agree at least most things with, especially when you're raising your kids, they end up thinking that your children are some kind of lie that you need to uncover and find out the truth about your children. It's a pretty destructive conversation. But that wasn't it. It started to go into the topic of John and his crazy theories. Maybe they weren't so crazy after all, but maybe there was a little bit more to find out. They started to notice that a lot of these toys that they had packed away and moved from place to place, literally like an Annabelle. You guys know that doll, right? Well, these girls had toys of their own. And some of these toys were secondhand. Maybe some of them were even Florence's when she was a little girl. But either way, the girls seemed to know about these toys. Know things that they shouldn't have known. Remember when I told you guys that these little girls had remembered certain things about places that they'd experienced? They also remembered experiences that they supposedly had with certain toys that Florence and John had gifted them. As this came up, this thing with toys, locations, places that they knew about, memories that they had never actually experienced themselves, more things started to unravel. Maybe there was a lie about their children that they had to uncover. There was more to it. There were things that correlated and aligned too coincidentally with John and Florence saying, wait, those things that the girls are doing seem familiar, but how would they have known that in the first place? Things from other family members that they'd known in the past, or situations that they had recognized these girls to know of. It didn't make any sense. Nothing added up for John and Florence, and things just kept getting more bizarre. Florence one day found her little girls. She overheard them talking to each other about something just completely sad, sadistic. They were talking about a car accident. They were recounting memories of a car accident. Why would toddlers be talking about a car accident they'd never physically experienced, seen? Sure, you might understand people are getting hurt, but the little girls were talking in detail. Extreme graphic, complex storytelling that they would go on amongst themselves that Florence was overhearing. And what made this really a freaky situation for Florence wasn't just that conversation about a car accident. Everything as a combination, ways that she thought, she began to question just what their reality really was, who she gave birth to at this point. It was like something out of The Shining. And any of you have seen that movie? The girls also seemed to have some sort of fear. They were scared of cars. Not just driving their own car as a family around town as they used to, but they thought that cars were out to get them, that they were going to get hit by cars, as it correlated with that car accident conversation that Florence overheard the girls talking about in the first place. It was strange, but it was more than that to the girls. There was even an incident in an alleyway while they were walking around town. While they heard a car turn on and hearing the motor running, they thought, oh my gosh, this car is about to hit us. And they just got terrified. They got so scared, deflected themselves from being hit, even though the car was far away. The car was never going to hit them, but they were scared of it, almost as if they had experienced that type of threat from a car before. They remembered a lot of it, but remembered it from where? Because not only did that happen with fearing of a car hitting you from an alleyway, but they were reenacting an experience. This time, she was going to really believe John's outlook of life at this point. Jillian was cradling Jennifer like a baby, and as she was cradling her, she was saying, "Your eyes are bleeding. That's where the car hit you. Your eyes." She heard her daughters talking about this. Now, her daughters didn't actually get hit. Jennifer's eyes weren't actually bleeding. This changed everything for the entire family. You guys remember when I told you that Jennifer had a birthmark not only on her hip, but her forehead? Well, in this same moment that her mother saw them reenacting this with the blood coming out of Jennifer's eyes, well, Jillian also said, that's where Jacqueline fell in the bucket. That's where she hit herself, and now she has that mark. But who's Jacqueline? Jacqueline is somebody that Florence knew from a past generation. Jacqueline had the same exact birthmark. Jacqueline had the same exact toys. They went to the same Hexham Abbey school and went to the same playground, all these same locations that Jillian and Jennifer knew about. And Florence knew who Jacqueline was, just like she knew who Joanna was. Joanna and Jacqueline, 11 and 6, were the previous daughters of Florence and John that were killed in the car accident a year prior to when they had Jennifer and Jillian. These two new twin daughters were their second daughters that they had. Florence and John could no longer deny his beliefs, the same beliefs that they had been arguing about this entire time for years, before the girls were even born. He had thought, you know what? Jillian and Jennifer are the reincarnations of our daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, that died in the car accident a year ago. And Florence, she couldn't deny this anymore. She tried her best. She wanted to start over, but she couldn't get away from her past. Jacqueline and Joanna, they were driving around town one day. Another woman who was high on drugs. This woman was high on drugs, and she went strategically and intentionally driving straight into this vehicle that they died instantly. And not only were the two daughters supposedly reincarnated into Jennifer and Jillian, but the woman that intentionally struck their vehicle and killed the children, she had lost her own children as well. She was going through her own grief as a mother and intentionally said, you know what? If I can't have my kids, if I can't have my kids alive and well, I'm going to take this family's children. That woman ended up going to a psychiatric institute. As if this family hadn't been through enough. As if Florence and John losing their two daughters, as if that wasn't enough. As if dealing with a potential reincarnation of their daughters, their twins, thinking everything was fine. Another woman was going through the exact same grief, the circle of life that John thought was possible. Maybe there was something to it. Now, while Jillian and Jennifer, the twins, they ended up growing up, they would go beyond 40 years old, and after a while, they ended up losing all of those reincarnated memories, those experiences that they had apparently had in their own lives. Well, it all sort of faded away after a while. They had reoccurring nightmares of that car accident, that specific car accident that killed Jacqueline and Joanna. Decades of thoughts of things that they could never really understand. It was a tragedy. Some of it they never really forgot. So what do you guys think? Do you think that they were reincarnated from Joanna and Jacqueline? Could Jillian and Jennifer have been the circle of life that John was talking about the entire time? Do you guys believe in that kind of stuff? Let me know.